Hello, I'm Austin Pollock. You're watching Uncensored right here on 6 News, where we go in depth with the key newsmaker about issues that matter to them and matter to you. Well, it's just a matter of weeks until voters in Queensland will be heading off to the polls for their respective local council elections. And with recent swings toward the Greens in some Brisbane seats at a federal level and support for the party elsewhere, they're confident in their chances, particularly in the race for Brisbane City Council. Jonathan Sriranganathan is running for Lord Mayor. He spoke to Uncensored a little earlier. Jonathan Sriranganathan, thank you so much for joining us here on Uncensored.
Thanks so much for having me.
Great to have you here. So are you confident in the Greens' chances at this election, particularly given the recent elections and shifts across the country?
Yeah, I'm confident that we're going to win quite a few votes and hopefully quite a few seats. We've seen a big swing towards the Greens, particularly in Brisbane with the recent federal election, but support's been growing for the Greens over the last couple election cycles. The real question is whether we'll get over the line in the mayoral race, and that's still a bit of an unknown because it's the biggest electorate in Australia. There's almost 900,000 voters in the Brisbane City Council mayoral contest. So it's really hard to know which way the city's going to swing in terms of the mayor. But we're, looking at picking up quite a few wards across the city.
Yeah. And why should Brisbane residents trust you in charge of the third largest city in the nation and one of the largest city councils and not the current Lord Mayor?
I guess the first and perhaps most important point is that we're really interested in decentralizing and localizing decision-making power. That means that it's not really going to just be me running the city. It's going to be residents having more direct control over the changes and how our council budget is allocated. So we really want to experiment with different forms of participatory democracy, local community voting, and participatory budgeting so that people get a say on the issues that are important to them. We're also really pushing the idea of cheaper housing and a freeze on rent increases. And housing is such a big issue in Brisbane at the moment. I'd say far and away the most important issue to the majority of voters. And we're the only party that actually wants house prices and rents to fall. We've seen both Labor and the Liberals make some general noises around housing affordability, but they don't actually want house prices and rents to fall. And so the Greens have been talking about a vacancy levy to discourage investment properties being left empty, a freeze on rent increases, a crackdown on short-term Airbnb rental accommodation, and a range of other measures to actually make housing cheaper. But fundamentally, the biggest difference between the Greens and the major parties is how we propose to pay for things. Everyone wants better infrastructure. The Greens are saying that we want property developers to pay their fair share towards the costs of pedestrian crossings and bike lanes and public transport upgrades, whereas the major parties are essentially forcing ratepayers to fork out to pay for that infrastructure.
On that note of the more participation with residents in Brisbane, can you give more specific examples of how that could work?
Yeah, so during my 7 years as a city councillor representing the Gaba ward, we experimented with a range of local decision-making processes. One of those was participatory budgeting, where as a local councillor, I had control over a budget of $500,000 for park upgrades. And rather than me just making up my own mind about how that was spent and what upgrades got funded, we said to residents, what are your priorities? Which projects would you like to see happen? Residents made suggestions. We costed those suggestions and worked out how much they would be to deliver. And then we gave residents a vote. So residents had a direct vote in where the money was spent, what projects got delivered. And each year, the projects that residents voted for actually got built out on the ground. So there are basketball courts and playgrounds and bikeway upgrades that were funded in my electorate because residents voted for them. And we'd like to do the same thing at a citywide level.
And Labor has ruled out doing a coalition with the Greens on council. Do you believe them when they say that?
To be honest, I don't think they're going to have much of a choice because the Greens are picking up wards and votes across the city. And it seems very unlikely that Labor will ever be able to form a majority government by themselves in Brisbane again. And I have said repeatedly that I'm very happy to work collaboratively across party lines. I'd prefer that Brisbane City Council wasn't dominated by party politics, tribalism. And that's one of the big problems that we've had in Brisbane for a long time now, is that it's a real us versus them, Labor versus Liberals. And I'm here saying, look, I don't care what political party you're from. I want to work collaboratively with everyone to get good outcomes. I think that Labor, if after the election, we find ourselves in a situation where Labor doesn't have enough votes to form a majority. The LNP also don't have enough votes to form a majority. I expect Labor will be willing to come to the negotiating table, but we might not end up negotiating a formal coalition like the Greens and Labor have in the ACT. It might look more like a case-by-case negotiation on key issues of policy and key infrastructure projects.
Yeah, and on that note, the Greens winning majority when it comes towards is something that seems pretty unlikely. So you say you work collaboratively with the LNP and the ALP councillors if you were elected as mayor, but the Greens weren't the largest party on council. So how would you work with them?
Yeah, it's been interesting watching other council administrations where we have some Greens and maybe even a Green mayor, but they don't necessarily have a majority. And what we've seen around Australia is that Green mayors are able to say to the other political parties, look, I was elected on this particular platform. Here are my priorities. Which of those priorities do you support? And starting with those particular issues. But the other way that we can sometimes create a bit of a circuit breaker in terms of the party divides is to simply give more decision-making power back to residents. So if I really want to introduce a vacancy levy to discourage homes being left empty long-term, but Labor or Liberal councillors are a little bit reluctant, we can very easily say to them, look, let's put it out to the community and we hold a big public vote like a plebiscite, and everyone who has an interest in the issue can cast a vote. And then we look at the results. And if we find that hundreds of thousands of Brisbane residents are saying, yes, I do support a vacancy levy, then it's a pretty hard thing for Labor and Liberal councillors to argue against that and say, oh, no, we're not going to listen to the people. So we can use that direct democracy process to actually highlight what people really want and use that to build consensus within the council chamber.
But you wouldn't want to be running plebiscites too often. Would that just be certain changes that you would want to use that for?
Yeah, that certainly wouldn't be for every single issue. It would really be those big issues that we've identified as priorities, but maybe other parties are still resistant to. So I think the beauty of true participatory democracy is that for some issues, you can have really localized decision-making in a particular neighborhood. For some issues, you might need to have a citywide plebiscite, but a lot of people will self-select and only participate in the decisions that are important to them. And so if there's a particular issue of concern around bushland restoration, we say to the bush care groups, let's hold participatory democracy processes that include you guys and any other stakeholders who are interested. So participatory democracy doesn't necessarily have to mean everyone having a vote on every single issue all the time. It's about letting people self-select into the issues they care about.
And the 2032 Olympics, massive issue for Brisbane right now. Of course, the Gaba Redevelopment, we heard some news today that it might be all up in the air. But the 2032 Olympic Games, will you be supporting them?
Honestly, it's going to come down to what the practicalities are in terms of delivery. So I've said repeatedly that I don't think Brisbane should have agreed to host the Olympics. I was the only city councillor out of all the city councillors on Brisbane City Council to oppose Brisbane putting in a bid. And I've been a consistent vocal critic of the proposal to demolish and rebuild the Gaba. And now it's looking like that Gaba proposal is about to be scrapped. But there are still broader concerns with the Olympics. For example, we want to make sure that the athlete village is reverted to public housing after the Olympics are over. It doesn't make sense. What the state government is proposing at the moment is that after the Olympics are over, that athletes village will essentially be sold off and rented out privately for profit. Similarly, we want to make sure that any other proposals for stadium upgrades or major venue upgrades are supported by sufficient public transport infrastructure. We want to ensure that there are sufficient measures in place to ensure that the Olympics doesn't lead to low-income renters being pushed out of their neighbourhoods. And we know from many Olympics that there's a persistent problem where landlords will kick out long-term tenants and convert those homes into short-term rental accommodation. And that's something that the government needs to be proactively addressing before the Olympics comes up. So there are a lot of concerns we have about the Olympics. And if every single one of those concerns can be adequately addressed, then yeah, sure, maybe I'll get behind the Olympics. But my starting position is to say there are a lot of costs and a lot of impacts that we need to address. And if the government addresses those, then we can talk further.
If they aren't addressed, will you be advocating for the 2032 Olympics to be scrapped in Brisbane? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I probably, as a mayor, wouldn't have unilateral power to scrap the Olympics. It would likely become a bigger state government issue because the reality is that the Queensland government cannot deliver a Brisbane Olympics without the strong logistical and symbolic support of Brisbane City Council. So we would actually have quite a lot of leverage in the situation, and it would come down to, I guess, sometimes messy negotiation process. But realistically, for Brisbane residents, if you have a state government and a federal government that are firmly behind the Olympics and are saying, let's push ahead with the Olympics at all costs, it's actually really beneficial from a democratic perspective to have a local institution that's saying, sure, the Olympics can go ahead, but we want to make sure it meets the public interest. And taking that initial position of Olympic skepticism ensures that we can come at it from a stronger bargaining position and negotiate really good outcomes for the city. So it's honestly a little bit hard to give a very direct answer and say, will you definitely support the Olympics? Because it's going to depend how it's done and what's on the table.
The Gaba Redevelopment, it's going to be quite a major talking point for the next few years as we get closer to the Olympic Games. Why don't you think that should be rebuilt? It's a very old stadium. We've heard many, all the sports that played there, AFL cricket, they are concerned about the facilities. What do you think has to be done about the Gaba, one of Brisbane's central sporting locations?
I guess the starting point is recognizing that it's not actually that old. It last had a big rebuild about 20 years ago. And the fact that people are already saying it's getting towards the end of its life and it needs upgrades says something more broader about the problems of major infrastructure projects. If we're spending so much money building stadiums that only last a couple of decades, we need deeper changes to the way we plan and design major infrastructure. But the Gaba in its current form does have some problems. I've heard that it doesn't have enough elevators and that disability access isn't great. There are concerns about seepage and moisture down in the change rooms at the lower levels. But the reality right now is that there are lots of priorities for infrastructure and public facilities investment in Queensland. We've got a government that's telling us they still don't have the money or the resources or the construction force, labour power to build all the public housing we need. There are shortages in terms of school classroom capacity, in terms of hospital capacity. So it's really a question of priorities. If we have all the public housing sorted and we have the hospitals and the schools and all the other public transport infrastructure we need sorted, then we can start talking about redesigning or rebuilding stadiums. But right now, the $3 billion proposal to demolish the Gaba is a waste of money, a waste of resources, and we don't really have the construction labour force to sustain that alongside all the other projects that are proposed to happen. So one of the biggest immediate concerns with the Gaba is the proposal to shut down and relocate East Brisbane State School. But even if it was possible to redesign the Gaba without impacting the state school, you would still have those serious concerns about the cost of the project and the impact to the broader economy, and those need to be seriously considered.
Do you think the state government and indeed the local government, Brisbane City Council, owe an apology to Brisbane residents about this Gaba debacle?
Yeah, I think a lot of people are really frustrated. I feel like they owe me an apology because I've been saying to them for a solid 3 years now that this was a terrible idea. From the moment it was proposed, I wrote to the relevant ministers and I clearly outlined a list of concerns. I even had a meeting with Stephen Miles, myself and State MP Amy McMahon, went to his office in the city and he sat down with us for about 25 minutes and we talked him through the concerns in great detail. And he nodded and he thanked us, and then he proceeded with pushing ahead with that project for the next two and a half years. And so it's really frustrating that it's taken the government this long to recognise those serious concerns from the community. And I do think they owe us an apology, not only for taking such a long time to see common sense, but for the amount of money that's already been wasted and the amount of time that's already been lost. It's a chronically mismanaged project. And I think residents are right to be concerned that whatever other stadium alternatives they now put on the table, there are legitimate concerns that they won't do a good job of listening to the community about those options either.
Last thing on a more state politics questions. Would you work well with Stephen Miles, do you think, from your experience with him? We have a state election coming up in October. Would you be happy to see him re-elected?
I'd much prefer to see the Greens win a bunch of seats off Labor and have significantly more negotiating power. I think Stephen Miles is certainly preferable to the LNP, a leader of the opposition, but I do think Miles has moved a long way from his progressive roots. When I first met him many years ago, he seemed to be genuinely concerned about global warming and climate change. Yet just in the last couple of days, his administration has again approved a new coal mine. And the fact that the Queensland Labor Party is still approving new coal mines in 2024, when we know how serious global warming is, shows that they are completely beholden to the mining industry and fossil fuel interests. And this is a real sticking point for the Greens in terms of our relationship with Labor, is that Labor is essentially dooming future generations to a more unstable climate, more precarious global economic situations by refusing to act in the most basic way possible in terms of preventing new fossil fuel projects. Obviously, we have to get to the point of transitioning away from fossil fuels, to shut down existing coal mines, to stop burning fossil fuels. But these guys are still approving new fossil fuel projects, and that is just criminally negligent when you consider what the science is telling us. So I think, yeah, I have a lot of criticisms of the way Stephen Miles has operated as a deputy premier and now as a premier. They've still been very dismissive about Greens' concerns in terms of housing and renters' rights. They have an appalling track record on the environment. They still aren't investing enough in public transport, and they still don't seem to be investing enough in public schooling, because I'm still hearing from lots of families who are struggling to afford rising school costs when public school is supposed to be free. So I think the Labor government at the Queensland level is doing a terrible job. I don't think the LNP would do a better job, though, but I really hope that Labor will take note of the fact that there's growing support for the Greens and recognise that they need to make some serious changes to their policy platform. Otherwise, they'll be losing more seats to us.
Yeah, back to local government now. Free public transport, it's a bold plan. How are you planning to fund that? There's already $1.9 billion in the transport budget. Are you confident you can fund this given the existing projects that are already in effect?
Yeah, there are quite a few very high-priced projects that the council proceeds with each year, and most of those involve a significant degree of road widening. And the Greens have said that we want to slash the amount of money that's wasted on non-essential road widening projects. Some of the projects in the transport budget are projects like Brisbane Metro, which we really support and would like to see proceed. But there are hundreds of millions of dollars spent on road widening projects by Brisbane City Council every single year. And if we cut funding to non-essential road widening projects, we can afford to make public transport free. The Green starting position is that we would like to introduce free public transport for everyone under 18. That means free buses, free ferries, free trains, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And that would cost approximately $13.5 million per year, which is a relatively small component of the council's $4.3 billion annual budget. We also want to roll out free off-peak transport, including free transport on weekends for everyone. And that would cost about $80 million a year. So at this stage, the Greens have said we want to spend $13.5 million a year on free transport for kids, $80 million a year on free off-peak transport. And we also want to run a 3-month trial of universal 24/7 free public transport. And that 3-month trial would cost about $45 million. And we think that if Brisbane City Council funded a 3-month trial of free public transport for everyone, demonstrated that it worked, learned from those experiences and showed how popular it was, it would be easier to then go to the state government and say, look, we've tried this. Free public transport has helped reduce congestion. It's gotten more people back onto public transport. Why don't you work with us to continue funding it? And so that's I guess, a straightforward plan to roll it out progressively, adjust accordingly in terms of network demand, and ensure that we can get more people onto public transport and do something about worsening traffic congestion and climate pollution from cars.
Yeah, and on that, trams, I saw on your social media that you are proposing a comeback of them. Brisbane is very well known for its extensive bus network. And now, as you said before, Brisbane Metro. Why do we need trams if we're saying you need to cut down on council money waste? How is this not another one?
Yeah, so we're very critical of council wasting money on road widening, but we think it's important for the council to spend a lot more money on public transport. We've announced a proposal to massively improve and increase the number of high-frequency bus services, and our priority is improving the bus network. So we've announced a proposal called the Brisbane Bus Boost, which proposes to create 15 new high-frequency bus routes and upgrade another 10 existing services to high frequency. So our priority is definitely improving the bus network, and we do also support extensions to the Brisbane Metro. But we're simply posing the question of whether Brisbane should also seriously consider reintroducing light rail. And the main reason for that is that light rail can move a lot more people than buses, and even a lot more people than the Brisbane Metro vehicles. One of the advantages of light rail is that it draws its power from the tracks, which means you don't have to have really big battery systems and you don't have to have those delays at the end of each trip to recharge. And considering the level of population growth that's predicted across Brisbane's inner south side and inner north side in particular, we do need to find ways to move more people via public transport. So we've simply proposed the Brisbane City Council would fund a $10 million delivery study to investigate more closely what's viable, what's needed, and what could work. And on the basis of that study, we would then down the track say, all right, Brisbane City Council can put up some more money, state government, federal government, can you guys chip in? Let's start building some of this infrastructure. And that's the pathway that other cities like Sydney and the Gold Coast have taken with their light rail projects. The Greens are not hard-nosed about this. We want to look at the evidence. We want to seriously investigate this proposal and see if it stacks up. We proposed a 24-kilometre light rail corridor from Garden City Shopping Centre at Mount Gravatt, past Griffith Nathan and the QE2 Hospital, up Ipswich Road, through Wollongabba and Kangaroo Point, over the Story Bridge and through the valley to Hamilton. There's a lot of major destinations along that route that we think people would really benefit from having greater connectivity and access to. And crucially, this would go a long way to helping reduce traffic congestion on Ipswich Road. So it's the kind of long-term infrastructure project that we need to start thinking about now if we're going to get ahead of the problem and cater for future population growth.
That is, yeah, it is an interesting proposal. Just finally now, Brisbane, it's compared to other cities, it's a very clean city when you drive along streets, even in the city as well. Do you think there's any changes that need to be made to the way Brisbane appears when you're walking through the city, including like in King George Square, for example?
Yeah, so the Greens have already announced a proposal to green up the CBD. We want to take the vast majority of car traffic off Albert Street, essentially pedestrianising Albert Street. And as part of that, we would repurpose some of that road space toward garden beds, street tree plantings, and public seating. And we would extend that concept into King George Square itself. So reducing the impact of that hard, hot concrete, softening that with more trees and green space and garden beds, and creating a green spine that runs from King George Square right down Albert Street to the Botanic Gardens. And that approach of saying, let's allocate more green space, allocate more road space towards greenery is something that we want to see happen in the CBD, but also right across Brisbane suburbs. I've released an opinion piece about how Brisbane should redefine itself as a forest city, exploring the fact that one of Brisbane's greatest assets as a city is that we do have a lot of intact wildlife corridors and a surprisingly high level of biodiversity for an urban area. And I think Brisbane's biodiversity is one of its great strengths that we should be celebrating and enhancing further. So rather than seeing streets and roads as simply transport corridors, we should reimagine them as public spaces and as wildlife habitat corridors too. And that means planting more street trees, but also more garden beds and understory vegetation, so that streets are habitat for wildlife and not just for humans.
All right, well, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for your time here on 6 News, Jonathan.
Thanks for the discussion. See you later.
And you can watch more episodes of Uncensored streaming right now on our YouTube channel. Just search 6NewsAU to find us. And over on our website, 6NewsAU.com. And you can watch the headlines on the hour, every hour, right here on 6 News. For now, until next time, I'm Austin Pollock. Thanks so much for joining us.